This is the Shadow of the Erdtree for McFarlane Batmans. It's one of the best figures of the year, quite honestly, from 2022. Which is rather poetic considering that that's when Elden Ring, the core base game, came out in 2022, and then 2 years later we have a DLC that goes up for Game of the Year. And even though it didn't win, I still think that was really strange, and it kind of provided an awful lot of ethical questions behind the policies of the Game Awards and whether or not a DLC should count, especially one that has the need for the base game and you need to pour an awful lot of time into it. Kind of posed the question, should one of the best Batmans of the year that I really had fun playing with, that I really liked to kind of toy around with, has some really great quality, great sculpting, should be considered amongst the top best McFarlane Batmans of the year, even though it's technically a repaint, a figure that we've seen already at least one time before, a couple years back when it was included as a page puncher for the Black Adam comic wave that included Constantine, Superman, and Black Adam himself. And it's actually one of the more discounted figures, not just for Batman, but practically all of the figures within that wave. It's one of the most accessible waves to consider picking up. And it's also one of the ones that provided an awful lot of value that I thought to myself, wow, this is actually rather unique. It's not a Build-A-Figure necessarily, but you get a comic book, you get the base and the card. So at the $24.99, I thought to myself, this is actually kind of neat. To me, my favorite was obviously that Lee Bermejo designed Batman from that series. However, he was very specific for that version of the wave where he had a much more muted down color palette, and a lot of people thought to themselves, yeah, this is Lee Bermejo design, but it's not a true definitive Batman Noel. Well, fast forward 2 years later, that specific bug comes around a second time. So for those who missed out on that original or just didn't really bother with that specific color scheme, you finally have your true definitive Batman Noel, and arriving just in time for the legitimate holidays of 2024. So that's even more poetic, to say the least. And as I kind of echoed in that original review, this is quite honestly one of my favorite builds for a Batman because it's very, very unique. I know that it's going to be rather subjective as far as the padding is concerned, as far as all of the different armor sets and the extra kind of girth to the way that the shoulder pads are designed, the Kevlar-esque kind of, like I said, padding that kind of mimics that of like army fatigues as far as the lining and the fabric and all the little details and the extra bulginess you got going on for the arms, the chest, the abdominal section, kind of like the separate plating that kind of zigzags its way downwards. But then, of course, the very engrossed, the very, for lack of a better term, swole thighs that he's got going on right there. But this is, like I said, sentiments that have echoed from that original figure. And so not much has really changed as far as the sculpting is concerned right here. When those promo photos were released and people were very excited for Noel Batman, I thought to myself, yeah, it's the same designer. I get it. It's the same artist, Lee Bermejo. So it kind of makes pragmatic sense to simply just carry it on over that figure and give him a repaint. But is it really going to be able to measure up to that original, considering how much of a fan I was of that original and how much I didn't really have that much of a problem with the color scheming with that? I actually kind of liked the army green. It kind of favored this aesthetic as far as, like I said, all of the paneling, the way that the shoulder guards and the biceps, that specific boxy design to the uniform or to the suit itself right there, and then kind of carried on over to the gauntlets, the very robust gauntlets, boots, and the overall finish to make it look very clothy, but like I said, some sort of legitimate bat suit of armor that looks like it could take either a punch or maybe even a rifle hit, combined with the pouches around the utility belt, the sculpting behind the symbol there at the front that's buckling it all together. And so many details I thought to myself, I don't know how much of a repaint it's really going to be able to carry it. But I guess the only real way to answer that question is to have it side by side with the original Lee Bermejo Black Adam Page Puncher Batman that was included in that set. As noted before, despite going for the 7-inch scale and trying to measure it up as best as possible to that scale, it is a little bit of on the shorter side. I would almost argue that this is one of the shorter Batmans. It's still taller than the traditional 6-inch scale that you have from other companies tackling different superheroes and such. But it's still doing something where this is arguably one of their smaller Batmen, if you will. But much like Wolverine, size sometimes doesn't necessarily matter. It's all about what you do with the size. But to drive the point across, you can very distinctly tell that this is in fact the same buck carried on over. You got the padding, you got the boxy nature to, again, the shoulder guards, the biceps, the bulginess of the thighs, but still having all of those different panels kind of coagulating together to kind of create that sense of armory, that sense of military kind of aesthetic to the overall suit, especially with, like I said, the pouches. But the biggest takeaway is the overhaul of the paint. It's really just a repaint, effectively. And at this point, it really does fall down on preference. Initially, I didn't really mind, like I said, the very army fatigue sort of approach to the green. So it's not super saturated in your face. It's muted down to at least complement an awful lot of the black aesthetics, as well as a little bit of the reflective copperish kind of tones and accents to the spikes on the gauntlets, the knuckles on the actual hand gloves, as well as a few little details here and there, specifically the buckle that is then bringing the very olive sort of skin texture to the utility belt. This time around, though, it's a bit more on the brown and tanner side, so you have a much more lighter aesthetic. You have like these smudges of, I don't want to say beige, but it's kind of like a very, 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 very light sort of velvety brown to the Noel Batman. So effectively, it's trying to at least bring us closer to the representation that we had in Noel Batman, where it's meant to be like this very grayish brown sort of in-between color scheming. And so you have an awful lot of that doing pretty well for itself in this version of the suit that I thought to myself, you know what? I can kind of take either. I really don't mind either one. They're kind of sort of neck and neck as far as color scheming, and it definitely does look a lot better in person, because in the pictures I thought to myself, I just don't know how much convincing a simple color swap is going to be able to do for me. But in person, it actually does a number better. It doesn't really do justice to my camera as far as color balancing, because it's kind of being thrown off a little bit right now. But apart from that, you'll notice that just so much of the body was just working so well that effectively they barely even touched it. The only few areas that I can denote besides the obvious would have to be, of course, the bat symbol has been overhauled to have a less stylistic kind of, I don't want to say classic contemporary look to the bat symbol on the page puncher version, because it's kind of going for the curved wings and such that is similar to what we've seen from maybe like the Arkham series, or just, you know, any kind of generic, even the Hush Batman, or any kind of Jim Lee aesthetical approach to a Batman has that kind of curved nature to the bat symbol, as well as the wings and the ears. Whereas over here, they went for the traditional Batman Noel bat symbol with the very jagged edges, the corners, the straight angular look to the overall bat symbol, where there's no curve found whatsoever, as well as a slight kind of, I don't want to say embossed lines there in the middle of the body of the bat symbol. So it's cool to see that they just completely scratched that off, so it's not as easy of a repaint. And then furthermore, you got the head sculpt, which is pretty much identical, except now the mouth is closed. He's still pouting. He's still very depressed, like he is in the cover for Batman Noel, but he's not really brandishing his teeth. He's not grimacing like before, but the paint applications behind the mouth plate are still cool, and the sculpting for the cowl is awesome. It's one of my favorites. I just love the, like I said, the much more helmety look to the cowl, minus, you know, the bad ears, the wide eyes. It just does so much for me that this is honestly one of my favorite interpretations in McFarlane fashion. And so apart from the change of expression, again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. What was a little on the ugly side was the very trash baggy sort of design to the rubberized cape that we had on the original. So needless to say, fast forwarding to 2024 and seeing how far McFarlane has come as far as actually I know that some people are going to get triggered by the fact that I'm using the term innovate, but at least spice things up a little bit if you're going to be raising the price by about $2 or $3. And of course, one of the things that we've often kind of pitched out there as a community would have to be the felt good capes, whether it be cloth, the nylon fabric, etc. And even though, again, I'm not the biggest fan of the nylon felt good to the approach of the cape itself, we do have a cloth cape, or at least a fabric cape this time around, with really strong bendy wires. It's actually one of the stronger wires that they utilized here for the outer rims of the cape to make it very posable. The trimming on the bottom is pretty traditional, but it favors Batman Noel this time around. And apart from that, it curves around the shoulder. I don't know what it is. I can't describe it very well, but the way it kind of curves its way around the boxy nature of the shoulder guards, the cowl, as well as just the overall, space between the shoulder and the neck, it curves so comfortably and complementary to the figure molds itself that I don't know what it is, but it's actually one of my favorite capes to kind of futz around with. So this is practically a match made in heaven as far as working a cloth cape, not having it be over-tailored, oversized. It's not drooping down to the bottom. It's the perfect size. And even though I would have maybe preferred a cloth cape, at least the reflectiveness of the outside, I don't know what it is, but it's just working favorably towards the figure, especially when you take into account that an awful lot of the areas that used to be a bit more on the matted side with the original Libre Mecho, as far as the pretty much anything that's black on this original version, like the gauntlets, the boots, and even a little bit of the cowl and kind of top shoulder cape area, is now a little bit more glistening on the new one. Now, granted, you can attribute that to it simply just being a newer figure, and so wherever the hell they mass produce these things, whatever factory and whatever printers they use within that facility, maybe they got new heads or etc., but maybe that is the reason for why it looks a little shinier, a little bit more brand new. But at the same time, just know that you are technically getting a much more glossier finish to some of those areas that are a little bit more on the matted side. And that's probably why the cloth cape, at least from the outside, works. On the inside, it's a little bit more muted and matted down, but I don't know, effectively, it's just doing enough here that you really can't go wrong with either one. And it really just depends if you're just that big of a fan of the Batman Noel comic storyline, or if you just want something that just goes a little harder as far as delivering on a quote-unquote Army Batman. And being a repaint, it's also going to mean that it's going to boast the same articulation. Generally, when it comes to repaints, I'm a little hesitant to cover the articulation again, especially with figures that have very, 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 very repeated uses, like the Nightfall Buck, like I most recently covered with Silver Age Batman. But with this guy, it really only it's been twice. It really only has been once before with this page puncher, and now he's finally resurfacing here. So I figured, let's, screw it. Let's go ahead and try it one more time. The head is able to turn 360, absolutely no problem. Tilting up is also pretty good. Tilting down is actually not too bad, not too shabby as well. It kind of shifts a little forward, so it allows a little bit more slack to cover some more of the neck when tilting the head down, so that's pretty awesome. And side to side is also pretty favorable as well. So again, it's one of the best head joints that I've covered in quite some time. As far as the actual shoulder, it's a little less limited, considering that we're now dealing with a bendy wire to just simply kind of move out of the way to allow the arm to fully rotate 360, no problem, as well as extend towards the sides. Just mind a little bit of that shoulder guard. It is, however, attached to the bicep as opposed to the top of the shoulder, so not much in the way of constricting itself. It kind of carries with the arm itself, so it moves with the arm, and therefore rotation vertical or even extension is not that problematic. Just mind it extending and kind of flexing a little up right there, because it is made out of rubberized plastic, but it is going to be there kind of in the way. Nevertheless, though, it reaches the 180-degree angle when extending towards the sides. There's a little bit of shrugging motion, a little bit of butterfly mobility within the joint itself, but just not as much as found in some other McFarlanes. The bicep swivel can still rotate. It can't really do the full 360 because not only the shoulder guard, the boxy nature to the biceps, and even a little bit of that, like I said, squeakiness can be found there. So it can nudge side to side, but full rotation is not going to be as pleasant as some other McFarlanes, unfortunately. So do consider that. Two joints at the elbows that can fully bend all the way up. And then we do have, I believe, the brand new joint. So it's not a ball joint, but a much more flush wrist joint that allows the hand to fully rotate 360 via the peg, and then can bend inwards and outwards at the hinge, no problem. Now, unfortunately, my only real criticism of the original Libre Mecho would have to be the mid-torso cut and the waist articulation, because even though they can nudge side to side, the mid-torso has always been a little bit on the constricted side. It can barely kind of nudge. It can definitely extend towards the back. You can see right there that these little zigzagged kind of pieces to the armament of the abdominal area can fully extend and almost kind of create this effect like they're extending. I know they're not, but it just kind of creates this optical illusion that's pretty awesome to me. But extending towards the sides is really the best that it can do, because crunching inwards can barely be done on the mid-torso cut. And frankly, mine was not really favorable to any kind of mid-torso rotation. If anything, let me test out the original, because I remember it being a bit more... No, even the original, I remember being a little on the stagnant side. So it does look like it's a problem that was carried on over from the original. It's a little limited on the mid-torso, unfortunately. But you can rotate a little further. In fact, the full 360 at the waist. The waist is a bit more fluid and loose as far as allowing the full 360 rotation, and some further crunching on the obliques from side to side, and just a little bit more to get you by on the back extension like so. Despite the massive bulging thighs that he does not skip leg day on, he can definitely extend the legs almost all the way up to a full 180-degree angle, so that's pretty awesome to see. Extension towards the backs is even not too shabby, though it does create a little bit of a gap between the diaper piece and the top of the very massive bulging thigh, so you do have a little bit of spacing right there, but it can extend almost at the full 45-degree angle, so not a full 90, but still much farther than you give it credit for or you really would have expected. And then extension towards the sides is also just like the original, where you can almost flatten it out, but not quite. Stops just a little short due to the way that the pouches are kind of designed here on the belt, but still, it's pretty complimentary. Two knee joints that can fully bend the knee almost all the way up like so. In fact, it's almost kind of reaching there if it wasn't for, like I said, the way that this thigh is designed. So maybe in hindsight, they could have pulled back a little bit if they were kind of reissuing this guy. Maybe pulled and dialed and kind of dremelled down the thighs a little bit just to favor the articulation. Not necessarily just because of the design, but maybe the articulation would have favored from that. And then when you get to the ankles, you don't have a ball joint, but you also don't have that joint that I really like, except they have a very distinct ankle joint that kind of resembles that of the ball joint, but for some reason it's almost, I dare say, proprietary to the way that this boot is designed, and because of that, it's still pretty awesome. It still flexes the foot downwards pretty far and upwards a pretty good amount. And then when rotating it towards the sides, it doesn't really give me any pushback, doesn't feel bad or anything. It's pretty fluid, but also still firm and not too loose. It can still pivot the ankle inwards and outwards, no problem. And then even the toe cut can almost bend all the way, actually can really bend all the way up. It's a little on the tough side, it's a little snug, and I kind of wish that there was a little bit more slack as far as how much it can bend up to provide a little bit of added stability, but the joint is still good nonetheless. So considering that so many of the joints were already working for the original were carried on over here, granted, like I said, they maybe could have fixed a little bit more of that mid-torso cut to allow further extension and rotation all the way around, because that probably would have been the thing to really kick it up a notch and maybe even make Batman Noel probably the preferred one to get in recent times, or at least currently right now within the market. Even if you can still get the Lee Bermejo Page Puncher at a much more discounted price, you really are getting almost the exact same figure. Now, granted, the original Lee Bermejo Page Puncher came with the comic, came with the base, the card, and it came with its own little batarang that's kind of shaped very similar to that of the Batman Noel design. As far as the way that it's angular, it kind of reminds, I know it's not taken from there, I understand, it predates it, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Nolan symbol, except it's got a bit more of thickness and girthiness to the middle part of the symbol itself, and then it's a little bit more 3D designed. It's embossed with this kind of like polygonal shape to the outside surface. A little oversized even when fitting it into his holding hand, but still pretty unique and pretty, different enough to kind of make a name for itself. Yeah. Sorry, I was trying to do a Cajun accent, but it didn't really work out there. Not an actor, damn it. Batman Noel comes with the exact same batarang. So almost nothing has changed except maybe, like I mentioned, about the black areas to the original suit where they looked a little bit more matted around the gauntlet and boot area as opposed to the slightly shinier interpretations here with the Noel Batman. The batarang is pretty much following suit where it's sculpted identically. There's nothing that was changed except maybe it's a little bit on the shinier side. But again, I can't tell if that was a design choice, if that was a creative choice, or it's simply just because they got new printers and it's a newer mass production, and therefore it's going to look a little nicer, but maybe over time it's going to start wear and tearing and becoming a little bit more worn down and matted like this original Lee Bermejo Page Puncher version. So not much has been changed there, but what was changed, since this is a singular release that's not part of the Page Punchers wave, and it's not going to be garnishing a comic, only simply just the card and the base, they had to toss a little bit extra. And here you'll notice that in order to kind of show off this extra, I took the liberty of adding the hands onto the figure here that the original did, which is this asymmetrical pair, one fisted and then one gripping to be holding said batarang. The other hands that he came with by default out of the box were technically this other asymmetrical pair. The right hand is actually extending and open, which is pretty cool. I kind of appreciate that, so it's a nice little different gesture than the traditional fist or grip. So you do have that going on there, but then on the left hand is something a little bit more different. It's actually a pre-sculpted left hand that is holding from one side a pair of very angular Batman Noel stylized binoculars. And I do think that this is kind of interesting. It's pretty cool, and it's cool to see that they kind of met us halfway as far as posing these binoculars, because recently we had another Batman that came with a set of binoculars, but it was a little tasking to get him to hold the binoculars at least with both hands. With one hand, it was no problem putting it up against the face, and of course I'm talking about the Nightmare Batman from the BVS wave. It was no problem to do it with one hand and make it look like he's holding the binoculars with one hand up against his eyes. But when it came to posing him with both hands, it was a little problematic because it kind of felt like they were at odds with each other, and it was pulling the binocular pair to the point where I was afraid it was going to break the binoculars in half. Here, I think we may have mitigated the problem slightly. Part of me, on one side of the coin, on one hand, kind of wished that maybe the binoculars were its own separate piece. But at the same time, having the hand be already pre-sculpted into one means that it's going to be a little bit easier and kind of cuts half the work to get him to look like he's holding the binoculars in both hands. And then on top of that, the left hand now comes with this much more open hand. So when you kind of put it on top, it kind of already looks like he's holding both of them, and it's a little easier to flush it in there since it's not that firm of a grip, or that tight of a grip rather. So it kind of favors this gesture or this pose to make it look like he's holding the binoculars up to his eyes with both hands. Or if you want to just be with one hand, then congratulations. All you gotta do is just swap out the hands, put this one on, no problem, and half the work is already done for you. So I'm kind of two minds. I don't exactly know where to sit at. If I want the binoculars to be separate so I can kind of appreciate the unique sculpture to the very angular look of the top part to almost kind of mimic that of a bat symbol in and of itself, or at the same time just have it be inside of this hand pre-sculpted so that I'm able to cut out a little bit of posing time when it comes to creating poses or displays with him and the binoculars in hand, like you see right about right here, which admittedly, like I said, it actually looks pretty good. It's the scale. Still wish that the batarang was within scale because it's just a carry on over. But at least they did enough unique stuff with the accessories that I'm like, all right, this is kind of neat. And it is technically not a page puncher, so we are kind of shaving a few bucks off the price. And on top of that, it's giving people another opportunity to pick up on, in my opinion, one of the better sculpts and one of the more unique sculpts for any McFarlane Batman out there. Granted, there is the argument to be made that maybe we should have had the Noel Batman from the get-go, and then later on as I like to call it, the army-ized version of the Lever Mechler design via the Page Puncher Black Adam comic version. But at the same time, again, you have these different choices. To me, they look like skins that I would proudly like to wear if there was ever like a Batman video game that was then really focusing on the Noel suit and even on the storyline. So here, you're pretty much spoiled for choice. The Noel Batman is readily available, but even from time to time, Amazon has like some major deep, almost clearance level discounts on this brand new version. So you really can't go wrong because, in my opinion, the sculpting is unique. It's awesome, the posing, etc. It just really falls down to preference. And because of that, it's practically one of my favorite Batmans of the year and harnesses a 8 out of 10. But at the same time, can I really call it one of my favorites of the year if it's a repaint of this guy with some minor tweaks? Let me know down below, guys. Should this be considered for figure of the year, or is it simply just a DLC that doesn't necessarily get by with that merit, considering they already did most of the work back in 2022? And while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, stay humble and take care. Peace.